My name is Doug Cuny and this is my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make natural bread leaven. A lot of people get confused about the difference between bread starter and bread leaven, and that's understandable because they're both mixtures of flour and water that support a colony of wild yeasts and bacteria that promote fermentation. So let me clarify the terms. A starter is a mixture of flour and water that you keep your fermentation colony in. I usually use a combination of whole wheat flour because it ferments quickly and organic rye flour because a lot of times the rye flour will have traces of wild yeast and bacteria on it even after it's milled. I don't have to spend a lot of money on flour or take up a lot of room in my refrigerator to maintain my fermentation colony in the form of a starter. That means that it doesn't take a lot for me to mix a little bit of flour, feed it a couple times a day if I'm keeping it on the counter. The primary objective with a starter is to keep your colony of wild yeast and bacteria alive and to do it as easily as possible. So you usually only have maybe a quarter of a cup or a half a cup of starter at any one time. On the other hand, a leaven can be made in sufficient quantities to make however many loaves of bread you want to make. And also, instead of it being made with whole wheat and rye, like you maintain your starter, the leaven is made with the same flour combination that you would use to make the bread that you're going to make. So, if you're going to make white bread, you make your leaven with white flour. If you're going to make whole wheat bread, your leaven will probably be a combination of white flour and whole wheat. If you're going to make rye bread, then your leaven will be a combination of rye flour and white flour. So your leaven frees you from having to maintain large quantities of starter, and it also allows you to make it with the same flour that you're going to use in your bread recipe. So let's say you're going to make a loaf of bread using natural leaven. The first thing you're going to have to do is figure out how much leaven you're going to need, and the way you do that is by determining the amount of dry flour you're going to use in your recipe. Whenever I bake, I go by metric weight, and the reason for that is metric measurement is 10 based and it's easy to do conversions, so why would you make your life more difficult? So as an example, let's say that you're going to make a loaf of bread that calls for 500 grams of flour. And just to mix it up, let's say that this particular bread recipe calls for 450 grams of bread flour and 50 grams of whole wheat flour. The formula for making your leaven is the leaven should be 20% the weight of the dry flour in your recipe. In this case, your dry flour weight is 500 grams. So you're going to want to make a leaven that weighs 100 grams, which is 20% of 500. A lot of people get confused at this point and they say, why am I comparing the weight of my leaven, which is a mixture of flour and water, to the dry weight of the flour in my recipe? Well, you need to know in advance how much leaven you're going to need, and the dry weight of your flour is simply just a guideline to get you started. So if you want to make your leaven to match your bread recipe, in this case, you're going to want to make a leaven that's 10% whole wheat flour and 90% white bread flour. Your leaven is going to be made with the same 50-50 mixture that you use to make your starter. So you'll be using 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of filtered water. So in this case, you're looking at 45 grams of white bread flour and 5 grams of whole wheat flour to 50 grams of filtered water. A good rule of thumb for inoculating your leaven with your starter is to use 1 tablespoon of starter per 100 grams of leaven. So in this case, once you mix your leaven up, you're going to inoculate it with 1 tablespoon of your starter. So in order to make your leaven, you're going to take 45 grams of bread flour, 5 grams of whole wheat flour, and 50 grams of water. Now we'll mix the dry ingredients, your white flour, your whole wheat, and then we'll take your starter. And you can see that the starter is ready to go. You might be able to see the bubbles. See how that's bubbling? That is ready to use. So you're going to take about a tablespoon of your starter. Now, it doesn't have to be real exact. And the easiest way to mix it is to put it into your water and then dissolve it in the water. Once that's broken up pretty much, then you'll add that mixture to your flour mixture and stir. Now at this point, you can feed your starter, put it back in the refrigerator if that's where you keep it. And you'll want to take a piece of plastic wrap and put it on your bowl. And there's the start of your leaven. Now all you need to do is wait and allow it to ferment, and you're going to see it do the same thing that you see your starter do. It's going to relax, it's going to become very sticky, it's going to probably almost double in size, and it's going to fill itself with CO2 bubbles. I usually make my leaven the night before that I'm going to use it to mix my dough. Depending upon the temperature of your house, it can take as little as 6 hours, or maybe less if it's very warm, or 12 hours if it's relatively cool. You'll be able to keep an eye on it and tell when it's ready with some experience. Alright, at this point our leaven has been fermenting for about 8 hours. And my house happens to be at about 65 at this time, so we should be doing all right. As a matter of fact, if I can show you a shot of it here, if you look at the bottom of this clear bowl, you can see how many bubbles have been created, and you can also see that it's become very sticky. Now, a while back I happened to read something very interesting in Chad Robertson's book, Tartine Bread. Now, if you are really interested in naturally fermented bread, you ought to pick the book up and check it out. But he uses this test to find out when his leaven is ready to use. He takes a small amount, about a teaspoon or so, and puts it in some water. And if it floats, like this little piece does, you know that it's ready to use. It's created enough CO2 that it won't sink. Now, usually I would do this with the water that I'm mixing with my bread, but let's say that you try a test like this and your leaven sinks. Well, then you fish it back out like I just did, put it back with the rest of the leaven, and put it someplace warm, or leave it longer to ferment until it's ready to go. So that's how you test your leaven to make sure that it's ready to mix with your bread. If your leaven is ready to use, then the easiest way to mix it into your bread dough is to dissolve it in the water, just like when I was making the leavening, and then add that water to your dry ingredients. As long as you remember that it takes 1 tablespoon of starter to inoculate 100 grams of leaven, and that your leaven weight is going to have to be 20% of the dry flour weight in your recipe, you can make enough leaven for 1 loaf or 100. Now granted, making bread with natural leavening is not as easy as opening up a little envelope of yeast, but I think you're going to find out that the resulting bread is by far superior in texture and flavor. At this point, if you watch my video on making your own bread starter, then you know how to care for your culture. And now you know how to make a leaven out of your starter, so the next step is to use your knowledge and make bread. So now I recommend that you watch my video on making no-knead naturally leavened bread. The recipe is easy enough that even if you've never baked bread before, you can turn out a really great loaf of hearth-style bread. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my channel, Cuny's Kitchen, and share these videos with your friends. My name is Doug Cuny. Until next time, take care.